Hey everyone, welcome to another video of the React Masterclass Series. In this video, we'll talk about React hooks. We'll start with what is a hook, the type of hooks in React. We'll talk about useState and useEffect in detail, and we'll also talk about the rule of hooks. We'll cover other hooks in the next video so that this video doesn't go very long. Hooks were introduced in React version 16.8. They allow us to use React without classes. So this was a major motivation to introduce React hooks because React is favoring functional components more as compared to class-based components because it was harder for them to optimize the class-based components, and the developers were facing a lot of issue related to this keyword usage in the class-based components. Hooks are functions that allow us to use React state and the lifecycle methods in the functional components. We can also create custom hooks to reuse the stateful logic across the components. So these are the following inbuilt React hooks: useState, useEffect, useMemo, useCallback, useContext, useRef, and useReducer. So if we talk about useState and useEffect are the most popular hooks. So useState allows us to track the state in a functional component. It accepts an initial state and then it returns two values, the current state and the function that updates the state. The setter function has a naming convention. So it starts with set something like over here, and then the property name in the camel case. So suppose the property name is value, then the setter function will have the name as set value. This is the useState method that accepts the initial value. So state will have this initial value and you can use the setter method to set the value. Let's see some examples of the useState. So we have created a functional component named location over here. So in order to use the state, I will import useState from React. So I'll call the useState method and I'll pass an initial value of the location. So I'll pass Mumbai over here. This hook will return me an array with two values. So first value will be the actual state. So I'll name it location, and the setter method, which will have to name it set location, just keeping the naming convention in mind. Now inside the return block, I'll return a JSX. So I'll assign a fragment over here and I'll pass a heading. So inside the heading, we'll say that the location is, and we'll use the state variable over here. So you can see that the location is Mumbai. So this is the way we use the useState hook. Now we'll see how we can change the location over here. So here I'll quickly add an input tag. In this input tag, we have added an onChange method. Whenever the text is being changed, so we are setting the location, which is equivalent to the value inside this input box. Now I'll see how this works. So suppose I'm changing the location to Delhi. Now you can say that the location value is changed over here. Let's make it Nagpur. And you can see that this is changing. So what is happening under the hood is we have this input box on which we have attached an onChange event. Whenever we're changing the value over here, we're calling the set location method that was returned by this useState hook, and we are passing the event.target.value, which is the current value of this input. And that's how the location is getting changed over here. This was the way we use the useState hook. We can pass any initial value to the useState. We can pass number, we can pass boolean, we can also pass objects over here. So one nuance about the setter method is, instead of passing the value, you can also pass a callback over here. The argument in the callback will be the previous state, which you can use over here to derive the current state. So we have to return the current state over here. So currently we are not using the previous state. So simply return event.target.value, and this will still work fine. So now let's see an example where we'll use the previous state. So instead of having a simple string in the useState, I will use an object over here. So I'll again pass city as Mumbai, and I'll also add country over here, which is India. Now this is throwing an error because I have used location over here. So instead of location, I will have to use location.city. I will also add country over here. I will use location.country, and you can see that it's showing the location is Mumbai, India. Now let me define two methods over here. So one is update city. On the onChange method, I will use this update city method. This will actually look cleaner instead of having the entire method over here. And let me add one more input box in which I will try to update the country. And let me define an additional method for updating the country. So let's define both of these methods. In order to update the city, I will use the set location method, and I will have to use the previous state to get the value of the country which I won't be updating over here. So I'll get the previous state as an argument. Now I will just spread the value of the previous state, and I will pass the city as event.target.value. Now what will happen over here is through the previous state we'll be getting the other values which we won't be updating. So here it will be country, here it can be other values like pin code, etc., which I have defined within the useState object. And city will be the value which I will be updating over here. So similarly, I will define the update country method, and over here I will be updating the country instead of city. So let's try to update the city over here, and let's try to change it to NY and update the country over here. So this is working fine. So this is the way that you can define object also within the use state, and you can use a callback to update your state where you'll also get the previous state. Now let's talk about the useEffect hook. The useEffect hook allows you to perform side effects within your components like fetching data, making an API call, updating the DOM, and using the timers. The useEffect hook was primarily created to mimic the following lifecycle methods within the functional components. The first is component did mount, the second is component did update, and the third is component will unmount. We'll see all these three scenarios with some examples. Let's talk about the syntax of the useEffect. So the useEffect accepts two arguments. So first is the callback function, and the second is the list of dependency array. The variables that you define within this dependency array, so when those variables change, then useEffect executes this callback method. Let's see some examples of useEffect hook. In the same example, I am just importing useEffect. In order to use the useEffect, you have to add a callback as an argument, as the first argument, and the second argument is optional. It's a dependencies array. So here you can put any of the dependencies. And here let's just add console.log. I'm adding mount over here. You can see there are two buttons over here. So in my app.js, I've added these two buttons. One is used to mount this location component, and the second is used to unmount the component. And I have used this state over here conditionally to render this location component, right? Now going back to the location.js. So if I click on this mount button, then you can see this mount was printed on the console. So this callback gets executed when the component is being mounted. But if I make any changes over here, so suppose in this input I'm changing the location to Delhi, then you can see that this is not printed. Okay, if you pass the dependency array as empty, then this will be the way that you can mimic the component did mount method. Component did mount. So you have to pass the dependency array as empty. If I want to mimic the component did update method, then what I have to do is I can remove this dependencies list. Okay, and instead of mount, let me add render over here. And let's see how it works. Let me refresh the page, mount the component. You can see that the mount got executed and the render also got executed. So let's change the location now, Delhi. Now you can see that I entered 5 characters. The state was changed 5 times, right? So that's why we see that render was printed on console 5 times. So whenever there is any change in the state, this callback method is executed, right? So that is the purpose of component did update. Suppose I have multiple states within my component. So in addition to the location, so I have another state, which is country over here, the initial state as India. Let's render the same over here like we did last time, but we did with the object. Here we are adding 2 different states. Again, I'm just adding an input bot that can change this state. Okay? So now let's see. Suppose you want the useEffect callback to be executed on change of just one variable or the state, then you can use that variable or state within the dependency list over here. So let's see an example. And suppose I want this callback to be executed only when the location is getting changed, but not on the change of the country, right? So in that case, I will pass the location over here, and the console.log, I am entering location change. Okay? Now, if we change the location now, so you can see that it's printing on the console, right? But if I change the country, so let me refresh this. So if I just change the country, and you can see that this callback is not getting executed, right? So because in the dependencies list, I have only passed location. But if I also pass the country over here, and then I change the country, then you'll see that this is called now, right? So this is the list of dependencies which actually track the changes. And if the variables that are added over here change, then this callback will get executed. Now, suppose we want to mimic the component will unmount within the functional component using useEffect hook. So in order to do that, we have to add a return method over here. Let me add console.log unmounting. Okay. Now let's add a few lines over here as well. So I'm adding console.log and mount. Okay. One thing to remember over here, if you want this callback to be executed only on unmount, then you have to also add the dependency list as empty. All right. So now let's see this. So when I'm mounting the component, the mount got executed, which is expected. Now let me change this to delete. Now you can see that none of the methods were executed. Now if I click on unmount, then you can see that unmounting got executed, right? So this is the way that you can execute a callback on unmount. So you can perform any cleanups within your method. Like suppose if you're using a timer, then you can clear those timers. Now let's talk about the rule of hooks. So the first rule says that you can only call the hooks at the top level of your component. You cannot call them inside the loops, within the conditions, or within the nested functions. So let's see an example. Here I have used the useEffect hook within the if-else condition, right? If the location exists, then now only I'm adding this hook. Now you can see that if we do that, then ESLint gives an error over here. So similarly, you'll get an error even if you will use within a loop or a nested function. All right. Now the second rule says that the hooks can only be used within the functional components. So that was the intent of creating the hooks at the first place. And the second place is within the custom hooks. In the future video, we'll see how to create the custom hook. There is a plugin known as ESLint plugin React hooks, which enforces these two rules. It comes installed with the Create React app. In the next video, we'll talk about use memo and use callback. If you're new to the channel, then please hit the subscribe button.